Hello everyone, this is Professor Graham and we are testing out this online video lecture for Lecture 4, Politics and the State, which we briefly began last time I saw your groups. We began looking essentially at all of these personal, private dealings that we think as individual citizens we have complete control over in a state, but that actually the state has a hand in some way or other. We're looking at why issues of statehood so important. Here are a few YouTube sites. You might want to have a look at these. They refer to a number of different statehood issues across the globe from Africa and other territories and are useful and interesting additions to your primary text. We briefly discussed the birth of the State of Israel in 1948 and how the Palestinian people are still fighting for their right to an independent, recognized Palestine, something they only achieved a kind of status in relation to in 2012 when they were recognized as United Nations non-member observer state status recognition. That's the name of it, the phrase used. Even though the Palestinian Authority declared their own independence in 1988, it is not recognized by America or Israel. We then moved on very quickly to discuss small island developing states, or SIDS, and how even though these states are very small and surrounded by water, they're still recognized states in the world today that have a role to play, especially in relation to the blue economy. How to use your territorial waters surrounding your island to promote your own economy and society's welfare. Here are 6 examples of African small island developing states, or SIDS. These are the following learning outcomes for this section. Number 1, to define the state and the various roles of the state, which we'll cover today. The primary features of the state. We know the first one relates to territorial association. That is, geographically defined how a state is encompassed within all of its borders, the geographical borders of a state. State institutions are public in contrast to private civil society. That is because public institutions of a state are responsible for making and enforcing collective decisions for the benefit of the whole society, whereas private civil society usually satisfies individual interests only. The state is an instrument of domination. This refers to state authority backed by coercion. A state must have the capacity to ensure its laws are obeyed and transgressions are punished. This is what we refer to as legitimate violence of a state. The state is sovereign, and we'll see why in the next slide. The state is portrayed as superior and above all other groups and associations in society. Sovereignty means that a state has absolute and unrestricted power over the internal and external affairs of the state. A state is an exercise in legitimation. Remember that legitimacy in political science is belief in the right to rule. So, a state as an exercise in legitimation means a decision of the state is usually binding. In other words, state decisions are accepted as binding by the population because the population see the state as legitimately in power. That the state's decisions are made in the public interest, reflecting the permanent interests of society. The most important feature of the state is international recognition. This is the classic definition of the state in international law. The Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of the State from 1933's conference in Uruguay, Montevideo is in Uruguay, in South America, came up with this definition of the state, that it must be internationally recognized in public platforms by all other states in the world. This picture links back with the previous slide under point number 4. The state is sovereign. Sovereignty means absolute and unrestricted power over the internal and external affairs of a state. Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher from a few centuries ago, suggested that the state was a leviathan, A leviathan is basically just portrayed here as another name for a type of sea monster, that the state has absolute control, it's overarching and powerful, and the citizens of the country have to obey this large, overarching, powerful state. Issues of statehood can also reflect in current times. For example, Sudan and South Sudan. Sudan, South Sudan, reflected on the map as such. South Sudan was born on the 9th of July 2011. That's only 7 short years ago. That means issues of statehood are very much alive in the modern world. Some of you may have chosen the topic on Somaliland and the issue of statehood. Here we have Ethiopia, Djibouti, Kenya, in the Horn of Africa, on the eastern coast of the African continent. There's the Indian Ocean, here's Somalia, and here is Somaliland. Somalia contends that Somaliland is an extension of Somalia. The international community recognizes Somalia, but not Somaliland. Another example is the Barotse in Zimbabwe, in Barotseland. The Barotse are an ethnic group that claim that in the 1964 treaty, Zambia's government ignored a treaty for the Barotse people to be separated or seen as an independent state. This is a western province of Zambia, and in 2002 the Barotse people demanded an independent Barotse land. It is not recognized by the international community. What other states have no United Nations recognition? Transnistria, or Transnistria, or Transnistria, as it is known in various sources, is in Eastern Europe. Here's Europe, here's Moldova, or Moldova. Here we have this tiny red sliver, which is Transnistria. Incidentally, Transnistria is a haven for the illicit global economy. You can get bootlegged alcohol, cigarettes, stolen cars, jewelry, all of those kinds of things pass through this territory. You also have Nagorno-Karabakh, which is next to Azerbaijan. Now, Nagorno-Karabakh, also known in some areas as Artsakh, recognizes itself alone, but nobody else recognizes this territory. We already know the example of Somaliland, also known as the Republic of Somaliland, which is really owned by Somalia or part of Somalia's territory. This is something you can argue in your essay if you chose this topic, because this is a contested, controversial issue. What about recognition by at least one or more United Nations member states? The best example of that might be Palestine, which is recognized by 136 United Nations states, not America and Israel, if you recall from my previous slide. But all it has is non-member observer state status in the United Nations. In a separate example, the governments of the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, which is really Taiwan, both claim themselves the legitimate government of all of China. The People's Republic of China is the China in the United Nations Security Council that has veto power. The People's Republic of China, or the PRC, is the mainland China that we're all aware of, that is recognized by the international community as China. How important then is the right to self-determination? Self-determination is essentially referring to the right to determine your own territory, your own governance structures, and your own people's governments on a daily basis. That is, you have the right to your own sovereignty. Self-determination is a very important sought-after concept in the international community. And it first came about with this picture painting of a treaty in 1648 in a German province, Westphalia. The treaty is the Treaty of Westphalia. The year is 1648, and this was the birth of the modern state system as we know it today, as we're currently living in today. And this Treaty of Westphalia recognized the law of sovereignty and the right for states to act as the principal actors in their own domestic and international affairs. What then are the differences between a state and a government? The state is more extensive than the government. Government literally is part of the state. Whereas the state is continuing, even permanent, governments do come and go. They're elected in and out of power. They can be remodeled, and they're temporary. Government is a means through which the authority of the state becomes operational. So the government is really the brains of the state. The state is impersonal. Personnel and state bodies are supposed to be politically neutral. That's why when the president is sworn in as the president of South Africa, for example, he swears to look out for the interests of all South African citizens, not just members of the ANC because he happens to be president of the ANC. Government is not impersonal. In fact, where the state represents the permanent interests of society, government represents partisan sympathies. The government is the leading party, or made up of the ruling party, or is a coalition of ruling parties. But it's certainly partisan, and those are the differences between the state and the government. What about rival theories of the state? There are those of us who suggest that there are the pluralist state. In other words, the state is seen as a neutral body, a kind of umpire or referee that arbitrates or looks after or judges competing societal interests. For example, what about those in society who enjoy privileged positions, like big business? In a capitalist society, big business always enjoys comforts that the government provides for them. So the part of the pluralist state is that the state is there to try and avoid this intensive competition, or at least to police it, or umpire it, or referee it, so that nobody is able to abuse the other in a state system. The state therefore arises out of a voluntary agreement or social contract made by individuals, because only sovereign power, that is the state, could safeguard individuals from insecurity and brutality associated with the state of nature, another concept that Hobbes came up with. The state of nature, where human beings compete and abuse each other in society. Therefore, without the state, people will abuse one another. What about the capitalist state? Look at this pyramid of these different levels of society and what they do in society. Capitalism is always ruling at the top. Marxists argue that the state maintains the class system by protecting capitalists who remain at the top of the pyramid, and it's always the working classes that are abused in society or disadvantaged. The capitalist state suggests that there is no separation between politics and economics, essentially. They are one and the same. The Leviathan state, which we saw from the previous slide as the sea monster, is a kind of, the view there is that the Leviathan state is a kind of parasite on society. The New Right, which is just a group of people, a way of thinking that they have, portrays the state as a self-serving parasitic monster intent on expansion and aggrandizement. The state therefore threatens individual liberty and economic security, and aggrandizement simply means that there is electoral competition where politicians outbid one another by making promises, which they never normally fulfill. Finally, we look at the rival theories of the state in terms of the patriarchal state. Radical feminists in particular point to patriarchal biases within the state that support male domination in society. When men are oppressed, it's a tragedy. When women are oppressed, it's tradition. This ends Lecture 4.1. We will continue with Lecture 4.2 in a separate video, and that will finish the overall lecture on the state. Please now go to Lecture 4.2.